King Duarte I, the Philosopher King, his reign was marked by deeply personal challenges, including family struggles and the burden of making some of the toughest choices in the history of Portugal, worth the life of loved ones. In what was a time that was also marked by the many geographic discoveries, would Duarte live up to his role? Duarte was born on October 31st, 1391 in Viseu. He was the eldest son of King John I and Queen Philippa of Lancaster. His birth in Viseu, a city with deep historical roots in Portugal, set the stage for a life steeped in the responsibilities and complexities of royal duties from an early age. As a prince, Duarte was well educated and intellectually inclined, earning him the nickname Duarte the Philosopher. His upbringing was influenced by his mother's English heritage, which brought a unique blend of Anglo-Portuguese cultural and intellectual traditions to his formative years. In the years that preceded his ascension to the throne, Duarte played a significant role in the political and strategic discussions of his father's court. One of the major issues of the time was the kingdom's expansion into North Africa. This strategy was initiated by King John I, with the successful conquest of Ceuta in 1415, a campaign in which Duarte himself participated alongside his brothers, including Henry the Navigator. This victory marked the beginning of Portuguese territorial ambitions beyond the Iberian Peninsula. However, Duarte held reservations about expansion into North Africa. He feared that continued military campaigns in North Africa would leave Portugal's mainland without enough military personnel, making it vulnerable to its Iberian neighbors, particularly Castile and Aragon. Duarte was concerned that the strength of these two kingdoms, in case of a conquest of the Emirate of Granada, could threaten Portugal's security, especially if the kingdom was embroiled in distant conflicts. On the other hand, Duarte's younger brother, Henry the Navigator, was a fervent advocate for expansion into North Africa. These differing perspectives extended to other members of the royal family, which Duarte would consult in 1432. Still, such doubts remained in Duarte, and the opinions of his family kept diverging upon his ascension to the throne in 1433. Within the Portuguese royal family, there were distinct and conflicting views on where the kingdom should expand to next. As already mentioned, Prince Henry the Navigator was a staunch advocate for Portuguese expansion into North Africa. He believed that these conquests were part of the Reconquista, given the fact North Africa was Christian before the Islamic invasions of the Middle Ages. Henry also saw expansion there as being essential for increasing Portugal's wealth, prestige, and strategic influence. Furthermore, the nobleman viewed North Africa as a gateway to the riches of the Sahara and beyond. In contrast, Henry and Duarte's brother, Prince João, harbored reservations about these military campaigns. João believed that killing Muslims in battle would only send more souls to hell, which could be stopped if they were converted to Christianity before their deaths. Meanwhile, their half-brother, Afonso, the Count of Barcelos, held a pragmatic view on the matter. Afonso observed that Portuguese Ceuta had proven largely unprofitable and costly to maintain. Instead, he advocated for the conquest of the Emirate of Granada. Afonso believed that incorporating Granada into Portugal would be more advantageous, providing immediate territorial gains and resources without the logistical challenges posed by North African campaigns. Despite the differing opinions within the Portuguese royal family, it was ultimately decided that expansion into North Africa would proceed. This decision was influenced by several factors, including the possible motivation of Queen Leonor and the diplomatic support of the papacy. On another note, in the first years of Duarte's rule, Portugal made important progress sailing along the African coast. In 1434, Gil Eines successfully sailed past Cape Boiador, a feat previously deemed impossible due to its treacherous waters and ominous reputation. This critical milestone in maritime exploration was ordered by Prince Henry the Navigator, who was determined to expand Portuguese exploration despite Eanes's initial failure in 1433. Eanes's successful voyage dispelled the myth of sea monsters and navigational impossibilities that had long deterred the sailors of the Old World. This breakthrough opened the African coast for further exploration and trade. It demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean could be safely navigated, setting the stage for future expeditions along the African coast and beyond. A year or two after his successful voyage past Cape Boiador in 1434, Gil Eines continued his explorations under the orders of Prince Henry the Navigator. Eines reached the Golden River, Rio de Ouro, and Porto da Galé, further expanding Portuguese knowledge of the West African coast. Adding to the new discoveries made, the monarch would contribute significantly to jurisprudence, with the so-called mental law, which was an important legal reform. This legislation aimed to address the complex issues of land tenure and inheritance that had long troubled the Portuguese nobility and monarchy. Duarte sought to strengthen the royal authority and ensure the stability of the kingdom by regulating the distribution and succession of landed estates. Under the ley mental, Duarte established that noble estates could not be freely divided or alienated without royal consent. This law intended to prevent the fragmentation of noble lands, which could weaken the economic and military power of the nobility, and by extension, the kingdom. Also, all the property and lands of the king could only pass to his eldest son, with the members of the House of Braganza being the expectation, as well as anyone the monarch wished. By centralizing control over land inheritance, Duarte aimed to consolidate his power and reduce the influence of the feudal lords, ensuring that estates remained intact and loyal to the crown. The ley mental was significant because it reflected Duarte's broader efforts to modernize the Portuguese legal system and strengthen royal governance. This legislation not only helped to stabilize the socio-economic structure of Portugal, but also laid the groundwork for future monarchs to build a more centralized and powerful state. It was so successful that it would remain in use until the 19th century. Back to the expedition to North Africa, Henry's will would now be fulfilled. The objectives were Tangier, Cazar es Seguir, and Asila. Duarte gave his brother Henry 6,000 men and the plan of attack. In it, he clarified that if the advance failed, he should retreat to Ceuta and wait for the monarch himself, who would join him in the next spring. Henry the Navigator led the military, while Prince Fernando commanded the armada. However, Henry didn't follow his older brother's plan of attack, making his way through lands where he wasn't supposed to be. The prince opted to make a longer route to avoid combating Marinid tribesmen, which alerted the Moroccans of Tangier to Portuguese presence, prompting them to resupply. Food, weapons, and men arrived, which made the already difficult siege much more difficult. The Portuguese assault was not working, so Henry's men advised him to return to Portuguese-held Ceuta, as King Duarte had ordered. But Henry refused to abandon the siege. His persistence led to the Portuguese forces of 6,000 men being eventually encircled by the close to 200,000 Moroccan soldiers. The situation grew increasingly dire as supplies dwindled. By October, Henry negotiated a surrender. A treaty was signed, stipulating that the Portuguese would abandon their weapons and leave Prince Fernando in Moroccan custody. This agreement was contingent upon Portugal returning Ceuta to the Marinid Sultanate. Would Fernando ever see his homeland again? In January 1438, after learning of the disastrous outcome of the Battle of Tangier, King Duarte convened the Cortes of Leiria to seek counsel on the critical decision of whether to return Ceuta to the Marinid Sultanate, in exchange for the release of his brother, Prince Fernando, who had been taken captive. The Cortes, a consultative assembly composed of nobles, clergy, and commoners, debated intensely over this issue, resulting in 4 distinct opinions. The first opinion, supported by influential nobles like John and Pedro, brothers of Fernando, advocated for the immediate return of Ceuta to secure Prince Fernando's release. They believed this was the most pragmatic approach to resolving the crisis and ensuring Fernando's safety. The second opinion, championed by the Archbishop of Braga, argued against returning Ceuta without papal authorization, emphasizing that Ceuta was Christian land and should not be surrendered without the Church's consent. A third faction proposed initiating new negotiations with the Moroccans to explore alternative solutions that would avoid the necessity of returning Ceuta. However, they conceded that if these negotiations failed, Ceuta should be returned. The final opinion, held by a patriotic group, argued firmly against returning Ceuta under any circumstances. They viewed Ceuta as a vital stronghold and a symbol of Portuguese strength and territorial integrity. Ultimately, the Cortes of Leiria were suspended by Duarte given the many disagreements in early February. As for Henry, he wasn't present, most likely for the guilt and shame he felt. The criticisms against him were heavy during the Cortes, with many nobles blaming him for not following the instructions given by Duarte before the campaign. Adding to all his military and discovering pursuits, Duarte also blended governance with his great intellectual interest. A product of the Renaissance humanism that swept through Europe, Duarte was deeply influenced by its principles, emphasizing the importance of knowledge, ethics, and enlightened rule. His reign, though brief, was marked by his dedication to these ideals, which he diligently reflected in his writings. Duarte's most notable literary contribution is Leal Conselheiro, the Loyal Counselor, a comprehensive treatise on moral and political philosophy. This work offers profound reflections on leadership, virtue, and personal conduct, providing a guide for rulers and individuals alike. Duarte discussed the ethical responsibilities of kingship, advocating for a governance rooted in wisdom, justice, and ethical integrity. His insights into the nature of power, duty, and moral leadership were ahead of his time, revealing his deep understanding of human nature and the complexities of ruling. Additionally, Duarte authored Livro da Ensinança de Bem Cavalgar toda Sela, Book of the Art of Riding, a manual on horsemanship that combined practical advice with philosophical musings, further showcasing his diverse intellectual interests. Through his writings, Duarte significantly contributed to Portuguese literature and exemplified the Renaissance ideal of a ruler who harmonizes power with philosophical inquiry and moral rectitude. Though King Duarte was young during his rule, his health deteriorated due to extensive travels across Portugal, contaminating him with a plague. In 1438, in the old Templar city of Tomar, Duarte succumbed to the disease, aged 46 years old. Today he is known for his deep intellectual and cultural interests, and remembered for a reign marked by both achievements and personal tragedy. A learned man, Duarte was deeply influenced by European humanism and made significant literary contributions, including moral and philosophical works. Under his rule, explorers like Gil Anis, who sailed Cap Bojador, continued to push the boundaries of known territories, destroying myths of the Romans and Greeks. A bad note in Duarte's reign was the ill-fated Battle of Tangier in 1437, which resulted in the capture of his brother, Prince Fernando, though the result was not his fault. Duarte felt immense guilt over Fernando's imprisonment, a burden that weighed heavily on him. Duarte's death marked the end of a reign characterized by both visionary progress and profound personal sorrow, leading to a regency for his young 6-year-old son, Afonso V, whom in his kingship was able to avenge his father and uncle by having conquered Tangier, Ksar Segir, and Asila from the Moroccans.